The last number one wide receiver to go back to back was Antonio Brown. Can Jamar Chase break the trend this year, or will we see a new number one wide receiver? We break down the whole wide receiver position on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Today we are talking wide receivers. If you've got any questions, pop them in the comments below, or you can hit us up on Instagram or on Twitter. Plus, if you'd like to see my full rankings for all positions, head over to ffdfantasyfootball.com. And we're going to start things off with my number one. And even though we haven't had a back-to-back number one for quite some time, I'm still putting Jamar Chase at the top of the pack. I think he's got the best chance of being not only the number one guy, but having the best finish compared to the other options. He finally lived up to the lofty expectations last season with a 1,700-yard, 17-touchdown season in 2024. His 4-year contract extension was the richest for a non-quarterback in NFL history, and he is one of the league's most talented receivers. The downside, of course, well, players often fall off after signing a big contract, and Chase has had some quieter seasons in the past. Having said that, if Joe Burrow stays healthy, it is hard to see anyone but Chase being up in that top spot again. His closest threat, though, is Justin Jefferson. The top two fantasy finish in each of his last two healthy seasons makes him a very reliable and consistent performer who gets it done with any quarterback. And he's going to have to this year because, of course, he's got a new rookie in JJ McCarthy. I know he's not technically a rookie, but let's face it, this is his first NFL season. He does, however, come with an improved offensive line that should add more offensive opportunities. Having said that, he's never had more than 10 touchdowns in a season, and it is unclear what impact a healthy TJ Hockenson will have on his volume. So there is a little bit of risk with Jefferson, but with Chase and Jefferson, I'm still very willing to take Chase first overall. And for me, depending on the league settings, I'm willing to take Jefferson as high as number 3 behind Chase and Barkley. I know a lot of people are going to be starting to take running backs earlier, but if you're in a 3 wide receiver league that's PPR, I would certainly be taking Jefferson at 3rd overall pick. I feel like he gives you the best floor, and he's the most assured of getting points this season. I've got a bit of a gap to number 3 in CeeDee Lamb. He has had 3 straight top 6 fantasy seasons, despite Dak Prescott missing half of 2020, 2022, and 2024. The addition of George Pickens should actually give Lamb more opportunities and make him more efficient on a similar target count. Plus, Lamb rarely misses games. The downside, of course, is the Cowboys could easily struggle in general this season, meaning motivation may be at a minimum come the fantasy playoffs. The arrival of Pickens could also impact Lamb's targets, though the poor run game should mean that they have to continue working hard through the air to get anything done, and that's going to be very good for Lamb for fantasy. I have to admit, I've got positions 3 to 5 very, very close. My number 4 is Puka Nacua. He was the PPR wide receiver 3 last season on a per game basis, and he led the league in target rate. He was also a red zone monster, which is an unusual and very potent combination. While last season, an early injury was a brief limitation, he ended the season on an absolute tear. The question for this year, what does the arrival of Devontae Adams and Terrence Ferguson do? Well, for me, it drops his target share a little compared to late season Cooper Kupp, who really wasn't having much of an impact as well. Matthew Stafford's also another year older and may prove a little bit of a limitation, but it does feel like the Rams are in a win now window and they're going to have to get it done with Nacua. So he is going to be a big part of what they do during the season, and I'm expecting another fantasy monster season from Nacua. For me, he belongs to be taken around 6th, 7th overall in a PPR league, depending on how many wide receivers you're taking. He's a very good fantasy asset and someone you should feel good about taking in the first round. Another player I feel really good about taking in the first round, and I have considered moving up as high as 3 overall because I do think he has massive upside, is Malik Nabers. He had an elite rookie season, finishing as the PPR wide receiver 6, and he finished with the 2nd most targets. There is a good chance he improves in his 2nd season, as that's typically what happens with most wide receivers. He's going to remain the focal point of this offense with no notable receivers added. The downside, of course, is these new quarterbacks aren't exactly upgrades over Daniel Jones and Drew Lock. Though I do still think we get more passing volume out of a Russell Wilson and a Jackson Dart as we do over someone like Jones. The O line does also remain a limiting issue, and it does limit their ability to get the ball downfield. Plus, we do know that the Giants definitely want to run the ball as much as they can. So, how is that going to affect Neighbors? Well, he's still the clear number one option, and if they're going to pass the ball, Neighbors will always be the number one target. I think for fantasy, he is a locked in first round option that you should feel very good about for your fantasy team. Amon-Ra Brown has been the PPR wide receiver 3 in back to back seasons. He supplements a high target volume with double digit touchdowns in a high scoring offense. Isaac Tesla is the only receiving addition, meaning more of the same is very possible. However, Ben Johnson's departure could create a shift in the offense, while the emergence of Jamison Williams and the return to prominence of Sam Laporta might lead to a drop in target share. The Lions have been one of the league's most explosive offenses, but continued defensive improvements might limit that necessity this season, meaning St. Brown doesn't need to be as potent as he has been in the past. For that reason, St. Brown slides down towards the end of the first round, early second round for me, and I likely won't have a lot of shares because I just think the upside is limited. I think we've seen the best of what we're going to get out of St. Brown, and we might get it again, but you've got a lot more upside in the other guys in this range. Speaking of upside, Brian Thomas was the PPR wide receiver 4 in an explosive rookie season, despite some very questionable quarterbacking. The departure of Evan Ingram, Christian Kirk, and Gabe Davis should nicely offset the arrival of Travis Hunter. Liam Cohen has a history of supporting great fantasy wide receivers, and he's already named Thomas as his offense's focal point. The downside, of course, is that Thomas was oddly more effective with Mac Jones than with Trevor Lawrence. He was remarkably efficient on a per catch basis, and that could reduce as the team's focus on their defense leads to a lower necessity in passing output. So for that reason, Thomas slides in as an early second round guy for me, maybe very late first round, depending on your league settings. I can't take him above St. Brown, but I do acknowledge that he does arguably have a little bit more upside. So if you're craving that, it does make sense to be taking Thomas in this late first round range. From 8 onwards, I start to get pretty darn nervous. Nico Collins was fantastic last season. He equaled CD Lamb's per game points total as he elevated past an already very solid 2023. If CJ Stroud returns to his 23 levels of play, Collins should be the primary beneficiary with Stephon Diggs out of town. The downside is obvious, though. He's less of a PPR weapon due to his high depth of target, but also doesn't get that many touchdown opportunities to be a true half PPR or non-PPR weapon. The arrival of Christian Kirk, a pair of day 2 rookies, and a quality receiving back in Woody Marks could limit Collins' opportunities even further. That means that the upside is a little bit lower than it would be for most players in this range. He is clearly the number one in his team, but it's hard to know what impact all the new arrivals are going to have on his fantasy output. For that reason, Collins joins this guy, AJ Brown, as someone I feel okay about taking in the early to mid second round of most drafts, depending on your draft settings. Last season, injury prevented Brown from fighting for a third consecutive PPR top 5 finish. Brown had 5 consecutive 100-yard games at one stage and was the dominant receiver, as Devonta Smith and Dallas Goedert battled injuries and regression. The downside is obvious, though. The arrival of Saquon Barkley has meant the whole passing game has taken a big hit. Brown's efficiency has been top tier, but even a small drop in opportunities or efficiency will hurt his fantasy output badly. This is a bit of a hot take, but I've got Jackson Smith-Njigba as my number 10 wide receiver. He was the PPR wide receiver 7 last season and benefited from a second straight healthy season to emerge as the team's lead receiver. With DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett out of town and Sam Darnold a likely upgrade over Geno Smith, JSN could elevate further in year 3. The downside, of course, is Cooper Kupp's arrival, though for me this isn't really a serious threat to Smith-Njigba's supremacy, but it could lead to a damaging change in role if he moves out of the slot and starts to play more out wide. A step back for the offense as a whole is also possible with so many off-season changes to their offensive structure. Having said that, I would still happily take JSN late in the second round, but realistically, you can probably get him in the early third. And that means if you're picking on the turn, you can feel good about getting someone else in the late second, and then you can probably grab a heap of value in JSN in the early third round. Sliding in right behind him for me is T. Higgins. The question with T. Higgins is, how do you deal with someone who is the number 2 receiver on his own team? Well, the Bengals just gave him a heap of the ball. He was the top 3 PPR receiver on a per game basis, despite Jamar Chase's incredible season. Plus, if Chase goes down injured, Higgins could be a fantasy monster in a pass heavy offense that focused purely on Chase, Higgins, and a little bit of Mike Gesicki. Higgins' huge contract is a further indication of the high esteem the team holds him in. The downside, though, is obvious. Anytime you're the clear wide receiver 2 on your own team, you're always going to have a lower floor if the offense regresses or becomes more run heavy. A Joe Burrow injury would also totally take Higgins' value way more than it would for Chase. We've seen this happen in previous years with guys like Devonta Smith and Jalen Waddle, who looked very good until their offense took a slight step back, and they were the ones that suffered. It's always the number 2 guy that cops it far more than the number 1. For that reason, T. Higgins is a very risky guy to consider taking in the late second or early third round, because even though the upside is huge if you get a Chase injury, there is a massive amount of downside that could see him be a total fantasy non-entity. I know Drake London is very popular in fantasy circles, but if you're taking him as a top 10 wide receiver, you are going to be disappointed. Last year, he finally played up to his quality with his first 1,000-yard season, coinciding with the Falcons' resurgence. A full offseason with Michael Penix could take London to another level with no receiving competition added. Having said that, he has consistently underperformed his draft position in a team that runs the ball as a high priority. He should have performed better given his high overall and red zone target rates. And if anything, I could actually see him regressing. It's really hard to see London paying off on his value here. If you are drafting him in the late second or early third round, you need him to be a top 5 or arguably at least a top 10 wide receiver to give you any return on investment. If you're going to win your league, you need some of your picks to really hit. And it's hard to see Drake London really hitting. The best case scenario is he probably ends up on the edge of the top 10 as a wide receiver. And that is just not enough for what you're paying for him. So for that reason, London is someone that I will not have on a lot of my non-dynasty fantasy teams. Ladd McConkey had an impressive rookie season and should improve in year 2. It is worth noting the team was particularly run heavy early in the season and shifted more to the pass as the season progressed. A continuation in that direction will help McConkey even more. The downside, though, is obvious and there are many problems. An influx of receiving talent and improved running backs will likely mean a drop in opportunity share for the second-year wide receiver. He doesn't have the upside or natural talent of many receivers ranked in this range, and it's hard to see him doing a lot more than what he's doing now. We could see a lot more run game with guys like Hampton and Harris in there. Plus, we could see a lot more action for the out wide receivers now that Trey Harris is in there, and we also have an improvement to Quinton Johnston. There are a lot of question marks around McConkey, and yet he's still being taken in the late second and early third round. That's simply too early for me. I would much rather wait on someone like a Jackson Smith-Njigba or take another position here and then come back for wide receiver later on when there's a little bit more value. It was a great 2024 for Garrett Wilson despite the Jets' struggles. A first top 10 fantasy finish and career highs in receptions, receiving yards, and touchdowns. The departure of Devontae Adams consolidates Wilson as the main man ahead of a bunch of Jags and rookies. The downside, though, is all Justin Fields, who is a truly mediocre passing quarterback who could be a major detriment to Wilson's efficiency. He's going to need Fields to target him early and often to get any value. out of his quarterback, because realistically, Fields does not pass the ball a lot. And if anyone else gets heavily involved, Wilson is going to find it very hard to be a fantasy asset. I have a lot of concerns about what the Bucs offense is going to look like this season. We know there are going to be some serious fantasy assets coming out of Tampa, but the question is who? At the moment, I have to feel like Mike Evans remains the number one guy. He had an 11th straight 1,000-yard season and led to a top 10 fantasy finish in PPR and top 5 in non-PPR in points per game. Evans remains an electric receiving weapon when healthy and a vocal point of one of the league's most explosive offenses. He's also among one of the league's highest boom rates, making him excellent for best ball or in any situation where you want your wide receiver to score big points on a weekly basis despite having a lower downside. There is a serious downside here with Chris Godwin's presence, and he hurts Evans's output badly. The problem is we don't even know if Godwin's going to play this season or what that role's going to look like. If Godwin is healthy, Evans takes a big hit, but I think there are big question marks over whether Godwin would be healthy. The other big question mark is Evans's age. He's now 32, and that's a major regression indicator. So while a reduction in the Bucs' high-end offensive output would hurt, general poor play for Evans and also the possible emergence of Emeka Egbuka as well means that there's a lot of question marks around the Bucs stud. I love Evans in general, but if he's going to fall off, this would be the year where it happens. Hopefully starting to see the trend here that there are a lot of question marks around a lot of these wide receivers, which you can take in this third round, probably early fourth round, depending on the player. Tyreek Hill, likewise, a heap of question marks. Tua Tagovailoa was back in weeks 8 to 16, and Tyreek was the wide receiver 16 in PPR. But that's kind of when we're drafting him here. If Tua is fully healthy, it does massively increase Tyreek's ceiling, and I do think the Dolphins understand they need to get their number one more involved. But they also need to get Jalen Waddle more involved, as he was surprisingly quiet last season. Plus, they've also gone and brought in Darren Waller, and I feel like they do plan on using him as a replacement for Jonnu Smith. So the downside is obvious. Not to mention, Hill's now 31, and he isn't the player he used to be, as we saw last season as he had his first worst outing since his 2016 rookie season. He's also got a heap of off-field issues, a drop in speed, they don't tell him that, and some general O-line issues that really sap Hill's edge. It's hard to see him returning to his dominant old ways, but the upside will always remain there. And if this offense is surprisingly good this season, then Hill is going to be a big part of it and will certainly be a top 10 wide receiver. So the upside is higher for Hill than it is for most players in this range. It's just that the downside is very obvious, as we saw last season. Devontae Adams still managed to be the PPR wide receiver 11 last season in points per game, with his 8th season of at least 997 yards. Yes, that is specific. He keeps falling just short of the 1,000-yard mark. In an offense that could support 2 stud receivers, and after signing a mammoth contract, he is locked into a role with the Rams, who really do funnel their offense through their top 2 wide receivers and their running back. The downside for Adams is that he's now 33 years old, and that cliff is looming. It's also highly unlikely he supplants Puka Nacua as the wide receiver 1. That lowers his weekly floor and generally means if the offense struggles, as we said with T. Higgins earlier, that's only going to hurt Adams, as Nacua is a little bit insulated from offensive changes compared to Adams. At 18, we have Courtland Sutton, and he really got a boost from the arrival of rookie Bo Nix, leading to his first 1,000-yard season since 2019 and his best ever fantasy season as the wide receiver 15. Nix's second season could lead to a boost in Sutton's output as well, but the downside is all the other weapons that arrived around him. Several new running backs could lead to an improved run game, and Evan Ingram's target hogging tendencies are always a threat to Sutton's target share. Sutton could easily fall off in his age 30 season as well. Not to mention the arrival of Pat Bryant is a clear indication that they want to improve what they're getting out of the other wide receivers as well. There's a lot of question marks here around Sutton, and yet I'm still very comfortable taking him in the 4th round as someone who should be a very solid wide receiver for your fantasy team, even if his upside is a little bit capped. A fifth consecutive 1,000-yard season led to a first top 10 fantasy finish in 2024 for Terry McLaurin. This was despite a reduction in targets. Jaden Daniels is a strong deep passer, and he really increases McLaurin's target efficiency. The problem is that 13 touchdowns from last season is truly unsustainable, and the presence of Deebo Samuel may reduce his targets further. His weekly floor is hence very low, especially in PPR, but McLaurin should still give you solid fantasy output, as Jaden Daniels, even though he's good with his legs, is a sneaky, very good passer who should help sustain McLaurin as the top option in this offense. He is entering his age 30 season, and that can often hurt speed receivers, but I think McLaurin is going to be good for another year or two yet. DJ Moore is another guy who should be the clear number one in an offense with a second year quarterback, and therefore he should benefit enormously from the offensive line improvements, giving Caleb Williams more time to find his deep threat. His 9.9 yards per reception was 30% lower than his career average last season. If that rebounds without impacting his target share, he could return to the fantasy top 10. But it's that target share that is the real question mark. The arrival of Luther Burden and Colston Loveland and the likely improvement of Rome Odunze is a major threat to Moore's hold on the lead receiver role in this offense. It's also possible the offense just continues to struggle in 2024, and that's going to hurt Moore as well. He even himself has admitted that he no longer wants to be the clear number one guy here, and he doesn't expect to be, and I do think we're going to see some real improvements out of his supplementary cast. For that reason, Moore is going to struggle to pay off on this wide receiver 20 valuation, but the upside is clear. If he is the true number one on this offense and Caleb Williams plays to what we expected last season, then Moore could easily be a top 10 fantasy guy by the end of the season. Travis Hunter was the highest drafted wide receiver since Megatron, and he is a very talented receiver and will likely play the valuable slot role for the Jags offense. Jacksonville paid a fortune to get the unique rookie and will no doubt make the most of him, but the downside is obvious. Let's be honest. If Hunter wasn't a two-way player, he wouldn't have been drafted second overall. He may not even been in the top 10, depending on the draft year. His two-way ability, if anything, adds a lot of risk for Hunter owners. If he's not shining as a receiver, the Jaguars could easily just shift Hunter to a primarily defensive player and leave fantasy owners with a guy who's only playing half the snaps. That is a big risk to take on a guy who we haven't actually seen out on the gridiron yet. So for that reason, I find it hard to rank Hunter any higher than this. Having said that, the upside is huge, and I do love the idea of having this slot guy in this Jacksonville offense. DK Metcalf has had 6 straight 900-yard seasons, and now he has 0 targets competition in Pittsburgh. He should get a big touchdown boost as the only true big alpha wide receiver, although Jonnu Smith will certainly come in and have an impact. The real question is what it looks like for Aaron Rodgers. Does he still have it in him? He's not exactly the most reliable distributor for a deep receiver at this stage of his career. No team passed their wide receivers less than Pittsburgh last season either, and their extreme run-first approach led George Pickens to a wide receiver 39 finish. Is DK really that big an upgrade over Pickens? I'm not convinced he is. While the quarterback is certainly an upgrade, I don't think it will be enough to make Metcalf a top 10 wide receiver. And for that reason, you are playing a little bit of risk by taking him in this range. Having said that, he is a very solid guy who you know is the number one in this team, and that gives you more security than it does with most of the guys in this range. There is no way that I'll be getting Rashee Rice anywhere near any of my fantasy teams. He's going as early as the second round in a lot of early drafts at the moment, and that is absolutely crazy. He is a consistent wide receiver too when he's healthy, and Rice should be healthy early this season and could become the definitive lead pass catcher for the Chiefs, with Travis Kelce regressing and Xavier Worthy more of a deep threat. But it's generally unadvisable to draft players entering the season under a serious injury recovery. It's also risky to draft a player battling legal issues, and it's scary to draft a player based on 2023 production when Casey now has Xavier Worthy and Hollywood Brown That's a trifecta of questionable gambles. Not to mention the possibility that they do run the ball more effectively with Isaiah Pacheco looking healthier this season. There's a whole heap of reasons to feel very nervous about Rashee Rice, and we don't even know that the Chiefs are going to pass the ball heavily because we have seen them kind of cruise through the regular season and really not wind things up until the playoffs because they are basically locked in for those at this stage. For that reason, I'm very nervous about Rice as a fantasy asset, and I'm taking him nowhere near his ADP, and I recommend you avoid him likewise. Highly drafted receivers often have a big second year jump if they disappoint in year one, and Maserati Marv has very little target competition outside Trey McBride, with a quarterback who should be improved after a healthier offseason. The downside is that the Cardinals have been quite focused on using their running back and tight ends in the past, targeting their wide receivers at a bottom 5 rate. It's possible Harrison is simply a wide receiver 3 in this offense, and that does hurt him. But the upside is there. If they start to use their wide receivers effectively and start to use Harrison as a true number 1 asset in this offense, he could easily pay off valuably at this point in your draft, where you can probably get him in the 5th or maybe even 6th round, depending on the situation and what sort of league settings you have. If you're having to reach and go get him early, though, I do think he does have a little bit of limited upside. After getting over 1,000 yards and into the top 24 for wide receivers for the first time last season, Zay Flowers became a deeper threat as Lamar Jackson expanded his passing game. There are no additions to this offense that should mean a similar leading role for the youngster in 2025. The downside is that this is one of the league's most run-heavy offenses. Baltimore targets their wide receivers at a bottom 5 rate as well. This badly caps Flowers' ceiling. A return to pre-2024 passing levels for Lamar Jackson would also hurt him even more. For that reason, we've kind of seen his upside a little bit, and he's very much more of a floor pick at this stage in the draft. If you're looking for a ceiling pick, though, you want Jamison Williams. New OC John Morton has stated that the Lions will pass downfield more often. Coming off a 1,000-yard season for Williams, an increase in involvement could be massive for the youngster. The downside, though, is that he averaged 17.3 yards per reception last season, and that's highly unlikely to repeat this year. A regression to even league average from one of the league's best offenses would make Williams barely startable in fantasy. So the risk is serious. But if you're going to win your league, you need to take some risks at some stage. And I'd rather take it in the mid rounds than with my first pick or two. And that's why Williams is someone that I will have on a few of my teams. Now, top 10 wide receivers from the draft tend to finish in the wide receiver 2 or 3 range in their rookie seasons. But we have seen guys like Jamar Chase and Malik Neighbors have shown that the upside is higher. Ted McMillan has the potential to be a true alpha receiver and the focal point of an improving offense. But the downside is that the Panthers have been very run-focused of late. Bryce Young hasn't exactly created much production for his outside receivers. Adam Thielen may remain the target hog, and Xavier Legette cannot be discounted. So for that reason, McMillan comes with a heap of risk in his first season. The talent is there, and I do think long-term he is going to be very good for fantasy. In fact, arguably, I think he's a safer dynasty option than Travis Hunter. It's just in a one-season situation, the upside isn't quite here for him this year for me. Jordan Addison is almost a handcuff pick for Justin Jefferson because if JJ goes down, all of a sudden Addison becomes a fantasy stud. He's already getting double-digit touchdowns as it is in both of his previous seasons, and O-line improvement should keep this as one of the league's best offenses, meaning Addison, as a downfield threat, will get plenty of opportunities. There is plenty of downside, though. If Jefferson stays healthy, all of a sudden Addison is the number 2 in an offense led by a quarterback we know very little about. JJ McCarthy is a big downgrade on Sam Darnold, potentially, and is third quarterback in 3 years for Addison. Wide receiver 2s also have far lower floors than wide receiver 1s, as we've said previously. Plus, the return of TJ Hawkinson to full health could hurt Addison's target shares. There's a lot of risk here with Addison, but the upside is huge if we see an injury to Jefferson. Calvin Ridley had back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons after his extended career hiatus. Ridley's the clear wide receiver 1 in an offense that should have big improvements this year. If he stays healthy, his floor is a wide receiver 3 with clear wide receiver 2 upside, given he has so little competition in Tennessee, and an upgrade in quarterback, though we are yet to see what exactly we'll get out of Cam Ward. The downside is that rookie quarterbacks aren't historically great for deeper receivers, especially in what will remain a run-heavy offense. Age is also a factor for Ridley as he enters his age 31 season. Ultimately, the ceiling is very low unless this offense is unexpectedly amazing. And the floor is basically going to be based on whether he has fall off or not. I do think he's one of the safer picks in this range, but if you're shooting for upside, Ridley's not where you're going to find it. Xavier Worthy was a top 20 wide receiver over the final 7 weeks of the season. He was the clear Chiefs wide receiver 1 for much of the year, both in snaps and in targets. A second-year jump could prove very valuable for the speedster, with Travis Kelce failing. But the downside is obvious. He averaged just 3.5 receptions per game, despite getting starting snaps for much of the season. Now Rashee Rice is back and Hollywood Brown is there as well. That's going to reduce Worthy's target share even more. So even if he's out there every snap, it's hard to feel very good about Worthy being more than a deep threat for the Chiefs. And with the way this defense works, they're not going to need to use Worthy a lot. That really limits his upside. So while the upside is clear, and if he's the number 1, he could easily be a top 10 fantasy asset, I think his chances of being the number 1 are very low. Jerry Jeudy was the shock PPR wide receiver 4 in the final 7 games of the season. The talent was always there, but we did not expect it to happen at the Cleveland Browns. He thrived in blowout losses down the stretch with 6 games with double-digit targets, leading to a 1,229-yard season and a wide receiver 11 finish overall. The Browns have no receiving additions when they easily could have drafted Travis Hunter, meaning that they see Jeudy as the clear number 1. The downside is that no matter who the quarterback is, Jeudy won't thrive like he did with Jameis Winston. Plus, the arrival of Quinshon Judkins and Dylan Sampson will mean that the run game should be improved and reduce the need for such an extreme passing game as we saw late last season. Doesn't matter who the quarterback is in Cleveland, it's hard to see Jeudy producing like he did. Having said that, there's more upside in Jeudy than there is in most of the other guys in this range. So if you're looking for an upside pick, Jeudy is someone you can go a lot worse than. After 2 1,000-yard seasons to begin his career before his 3rd year was destroyed by multiple concussions, Chris Olave has a lot of question marks entering year 4. The talent hasn't gone anywhere, and he's still got high-end upside, but he's now got Tyler Shuck or potentially Spencer Rattler as his quarterback, and that's highly unlikely to elevate Olave in what will likely be a conservative run-first offense. Even though he's the number 1 receiver, let's face it, it's really Alvin Kamara. He was also outplayed by Rashid Shaheed last year at times, which isn't exactly a great sign for the supposed number 1 in the offense. Devonta Smith was the PPR wide receiver 17 on a per-game basis, despite the drop in passing thanks to the arrival of Saquon Barkley. He remains an elite receiver in a high-scoring offense who is an A.J. Brown injury away from being a total stud. The downside is that arrival of Barkley massively lowers Smith's seasonal floor. He also suffered badly when both Brown and Dallas got it with healthy, and while it didn't happen often last season, when it did, gave him a very low weekly floor. So if there's no injuries for the Eagles, Smith will badly suffer. He does, however, have more upside than most guys in this range. I will likely rank him higher towards the end of the season, but I don't really want to draft him higher because I feel like he's less likely to win me my league than most of the other guys above him. I am pretty high on Matthew Golden in year 1. First round draft capital dictates a role in the offense in his rookie season. The offense badly needs an alpha receiver, with Jaden Reed only playing in 3 wide receiver sets and Christian Watson out for the season. Romeo Doubs is at best a complementary receiver. So the 429 speed that Golden has will certainly lead some big plays. However, the Packers have traditionally favored a heavy committee approach, and Golden doesn't project as a true alpha receiver, but more of a wide receiver 2 style deep threat. That means his fantasy ceiling is quite low unless he can break out of that mold and be the true number 1 for a Packers team that seems to just want to run the ball and kind of distribute the ball pretty evenly between their receivers. A former top 10 pick, Roma Dunze, didn't get the opportunities last year due to a struggling offense, a rookie quarterback, and a truly awful offensive line. It really was offensive. Those issues have all been fixed, and Keenan Allen's target hogging ways have left town. Now, new head coach Ben Johnson may recognize Adunze as a potential alpha receiver. The downside, of course, is it's a very crowded pass catching room with DJ Moore already there. Cole Kmet is now joined by Colston Loveland. DeAndre Swift can pass catches out of the backfield, and Luther Burden replaces Keenan Allen. Adunze didn't have a great first season. It's hard to project a massive jump in this crowded offense, but we've definitely seen it happen before in year two, especially for highly touted and highly talented receivers. I had a lot of Juwan Jennings last season, and I will not this year because he's going way too early in drafts. After years as a pass blocking wide receiver 3, Jennings exploded to a PPR wide receiver 25 finish last year as injuries knocked the majority of his teammates out. With Brandon Ayuk recovering from an ACL injury, Jennings may enter the season as the wide receiver 1 now that Deebo Samuel is out of town. But there is a huge amount of downside. With everyone healthy, Jennings is behind not just Ayuk, but also Christian McCaffrey, George Kittle, and arguably Ricky Pearsall, who, of course, is still a former first rounder. Getting even half of those 4 healthy was a challenge last year, but maybe that changes in 2025. There's no reason to think that the injuries weren't just bad luck for the 49ers. And if that happens, Juwan Jennings could be a real disappointment. It really depends on where you're getting him in drafts. If you're trying to take him in the first 5 or 6 rounds, which some people are, that's just way too early. The upside isn't there. That's basically the best case scenario for Jennings. Having said that, if you can get him in the middle rounds towards round 8 or 9, all of a sudden, he has a huge amount of value because the upside is that he's the number 1 receiver in an offense that may need to pass the ball a reasonably high amount of the time. So Jennings will really depend on his cost rather than anything else because the upside's there, but the downside is very low. Stephon Diggs is the clear number 1 for a young quarterback who needs a stud receiver to target. Diggs is only 1 year removed from having 4 straight top 10 fantasy seasons. And he looked okay with the Texans before his injury, but the downside, I mean, there's heaps of them. There's the Bo video. The possibility of being cut because of that. There's reports he should be ready by week 4, which is a weird thing to hear. And gosh, there's more red flags than the catfish's dating profile. After all, when was the last time drafting a 31-year-old receiver coming off an ACL injury was a good idea? I just generally don't like this situation. But I have to acknowledge he is probably the number 1 when he's healthy, and there is a lot more upside for Diggs than there is for most guys in this range. Speaking of risk versus reward, it's Chris Godwin, who I actually had ranked as high as my wide receiver 17 before reports suggested there are some real injury risk. He was the league wide receiver 2 on a per game basis last season. He's essentially the number 1 on his team with Mike Evans fading, and Baker Mayfield is a top 5 quarterback in fantasy output for his receivers. He is one of the league's high ceilings of guys you don't need to take in the first round. But Godwin has had injuries sap a lot of his upside, and there's always a massive concern he may not play up to his ability. Heck, he might not even play at all in week 1 and early in the season. So it's possible that injury has sapped his all-important separation ability or just his ability to get onto the field as well. The unnecessary drafting of Emeka Egbuka is a very bad sign as to what we can expect from Godwin. However, if Godwin's out there, he is always a league winner. He is such a talent. We're talking about a guy who finished as the wide receiver 2 early in his career, and that talent hasn't gone anywhere. And he's still young. He's still very much in his 20s, and if he can get healthy, he could be massive for fantasy. Michael Pittman, he's only 1 year removed from a career-high 1,152-yard PPR wide receiver 13 season. But he kind of looked like a Ferrari trying to fang it through a McDonald's drive-through last season. If he can return to health and some functional quarterbacking, he'll be a serious bargain in 2025. But what are the odds of functional quarterbacking when you've got Anthony Richardson and Daniel Jones to choose from? They will be serious limiting factors, and there remain concerns about Pittman's back. That limited him throughout 2024, and it could remain an issue. The talent is there for Pittman, but the situation just plain isn't. And for that reason, I can't take him any earlier than the middle rounds of drafts as a bench guy who is really there as a bye week replacement or as a wide receiver 3 or flex in a deeper league. Jalen Waddle was formerly the PPR wide receiver 8, but he was the victim of a cratering Dolphins offense and Tua Tagovailoa's injuries. He remains an elite talent who could thrive if Tyreek Hill leaves for greener pastures and if Tua stays healthy. The downside, of course, is Darren Waller and Devon Achane becoming the primary short targets in an offense that struggled to push the ball deep. And nothing much has really changed since last year. So, short of a major strategic revamp, which is possible, Waddle will remain badly underused. Now, I just can't quit Keon Coleman. He was a major disappointment last season despite playing as the wide receiver 1 in one of the league's better offenses. Well, at least in snap share. But I'm going to go back for another try. Coleman is the only potential alpha receiver on this roster and should get another crack at being the stud we know he's capable of being. The downside is that the Bills brought in Joshua Palmer, Elijah Moore, and a big-bodied Caden Prather, who? A wide receiver by committee approach isn't out of the question. Plus, it's possible Coleman is just a plain bust. For that reason, it could be just Khalil Shakir, the tight ends, and a strong run game, plus Josh Allen's legs that get the Bills back into the playoffs. I'm hoping, though, that Coleman finally gets used as the true number 1 receiver that this offense has been craving for some time since Stephon Diggs left. The Cowboys wide receiver 2 role has more value than most offenses as there is so little target competition outside CeeDee Lamb. With Lamb likely attracting a lot of double coverage again this season, Pickens could thrive now that he's no longer the defense's primary focus. The downside, though, is he is more of a big play threat than a volume contributor. Pickens could be a better NFL asset than a fantasy asset this season for Dallas. Steelers receivers have a long history of busting at their second teams relative to expectations as well. Think Antonio Brown, Juju Smith-Schuster, guys like that who were excellent in Pittsburgh, but then went elsewhere and really struggled. That could easily be the case here with Pickens, who is a prickly customer at best. Khalil Shakir signed a big 4-year extension, locking him in as a key cog in one of the league's better offenses. He's got very little competition in the wide receiver room at the moment, which means he'll likely be a top target getter again. The downside is that he's got very little red zone usage, which limits his scoring upside, and he's never going to be a true alpha receiver, which means he has a very low ceiling. He's someone you can feel good about having on your bench as a bye week filler, but you need some more upside at this stage in the draft. And if you're drafting him as a bench guy who you're not planning on using regularly, you might as well draft someone with upside who could actually come in and be a true asset for your fantasy team. That will never be Shakir. The Commanders badly needed another reliable receiver beside Terry McLaurin, and Debo has arrived to be that man. There's no questioning his talent, as he's only a season removed from a PPR wide receiver 14 finish, and he also has a wide receiver 3 finish on his resume, but he's nearing 30 and not looking the same player in 2024. It's hard to know whether career revival is on the cards for Debo. Scary Terry will remain the clear number 1 in Washington, and it's hard to know how much volume the wide receiver 2 will get on this offense. It hasn't traditionally been very much. That could mean a lot of weekly variability, and that's scary for fantasy. Don't pay up for the big name. I would be expecting that I'll have very little Debo on my fantasy teams. Ricky Pearsall is a former first rounder who could step into the void formed by Debo Samuel's departure and Brandon Ayuk's ACL injury. Now that he's fully recovered from his gunshot injury, Pearsall looks good late in 2024. The downside is there are a lot of talented players ahead of Pearsall in the pecking order, and injuring his hamstrings during OTAs won't improve his chances of making a play for a more valuable role. He likely enters the season as the wide receiver 3 in an offense that also has the league's best receivers at running back and tight end. There's a lot of concerns around Pearsall's floor, but at this stage in the draft, you're kind of better off shooting for upside, and Pearsall certainly has that. Speaking of upside, here is a big-bodied second-rounder rookie. It's Trey Harris, who is a very natural complement to Ladd McConkey, who was extremely productive in college. Harris is a mammoth receiver who could be a serious red zone target and contested catch guy with alpha upside if everything falls his way. The downside is that he's competing with Quentin Johnston and I guess Mike Williams as well for the wide receiver 2 role at best behind McConkey. and that this will mainly remain a run-heavy offense with a conservative passing attack on the back of multiple top running back additions. Trey Harris also has some serious separation concerns for the NFL, so we're talking about a serious risk with serious upside. What better player to take at this stage in the middle rounds of the drafts? Jacoby Myers enjoyed his first 1,000-yard season in 2024, leading to his best ever fantasy finish as the PPR wide receiver 29. But he has been a top 32 wide receiver in each of his last 4 seasons. He's tremendously consistent, despite a heap of missed games, poor quarterbacking, and very bad play calling. Geno Smith is bizarrely one of his better quarterbacks, and he remains the wide receiver 1, although some would argue that the rookies in Jack Bear or alternatively Don Thornton will come in and threaten that role. The downside, though, is not only those rookies, but also Ashton Jeanty coming in to take a whole heap of targets. Plus, let's face it, the true number 1 receiver for the Raiders is actually Brock Bowers. So it's hard to feel very good about Myers' upside, but his floor is at least solid as someone who's going to be involved in this offense. Jaden Reed's had back-to-back wide receiver 28 seasons as the top target getter in the Packers' weird wide receiver by committee. He's consistently a high touchdown scorer, and Reed's role is likely to be unaffected by the offensive additions. The downside, though, is that he has a low ceiling as a guy who only plays in 3 wide receiver sets. Touchdown regression is also very possible, and he's likely to have a reduced role with Matthew Golden and also Savion Williams coming in. Now, back in 2021, Cooper Kupp was the league wide receiver 1 with nearly 2,000 yards and 16 touchdowns. If he can stay healthy, Sam Darnold is well and truly capable of sustaining 2 fantasy-relevant wide receivers, especially given his running backs and tight ends aren't exactly elite receiving options, and there isn't a wide receiver 3 of note. The 3-year, $45 million contract certainly suggests that the Seahawks believe Kupp is capable of offering a lot to the team. The downside, though, is that Kupp looked awful in 2024, and I have no idea what the Seahawks saw to give him that sort of contract. For me, Kupp is more likely to be entirely washed than a true asset for this team. With JSN playing the high-volume underneath role, it's hard to know exactly what Kupp can offer this offense outside a supplementary role, and that's going to be bad for fantasy. Now, Brandon Ayuk followed his 2022 wide receiver 17 finish with a wide receiver 12 finish in 2023. Then it all fell apart last year in 24. But with Deebo Samuel out the door and Ayuk the clear number 1 receiver in an offense hoping to return to being a Super Bowl contender, Ayuk will need to shine if the team is going to have a chance of threatening guys like the Eagles this season. The downside, though, is that the trade rumors continue to swirl, as do questions around whether Ayuk will even be ready by week 1. It's generally best to avoid players coming off ACL injuries, and while Ayuk's happened quite early last season, it was a bad one. His range of possible outcomes are wider than most, but if you're drafting him in the middle or late rounds, he definitely has top-end upside compared to a lot of guys in this range. Darnell Mooney was the shock wide receiver 8 through 10 weeks of last season, but he did fade down the stretch as Kirk Cousins faded and turned into Michael Penix. Mooney still finished as the wide receiver 27 for the second time in his career and is the clear wide receiver 2 in an offense that's expected to take a step forward in 2025. The downside, though, is that Bijan Robinson is always a major target threat, and Ray-Ray McCloud received the 3rd most targets per game among teams' wide receiver 3s. Plus, Kyle Pitts is always a threat to return to his rookie target rate. So being the Falcons' wide receiver 2 has a seriously low floor as a result. He's, for me, more of a best ball asset than someone you really want in your redraft teams. Cedric Tillman emerged out of nowhere to be the league wide receiver 1 from weeks 7 to 9 before an injury took him out for the season. He'll likely enter the season as the Browns wide receiver 2, and that could be a valuable role, especially if Joe Flacco's under center. The downside, of course, is that David Njoku and Jerry Jeudy have been serious target hogs, and if the Browns are very run-centric with the addition of Quinshon Judkins, things could get very tricky for Tillman. He's a low-floor speculative option with literally 3 weeks of production over his 25 career games. Having said that, he is one of my favorite late-round targets, as I do think the upside is huge for Tillman as a former day 2 pick with a lot of talent. Speaking of being a big guy with a lot of talent, Jaden Higgins Early second rounders usually become starters in their rookie seasons, and Higgins should do just that as the second outside receiver across from Nico Collins. Stephon Diggs was productive as the Texans' wide receiver 2 last season, so there is a chance that Higgins could get volume, even though I don't think that will be his role this season. I think he's unlikely to hold a high volume role with Collins the clear star and Christian Kirk, or I guess Jalen Knoll, in the slot. It's entirely possible that Higgins starts the season quiet and will need to emerge into something as the year goes on, either because of a Collins injury or because his play dictates more targets. I'm very nervous about Higgins in the short term, and even in the long term, I'm really not sure exactly why the Texans drafted him despite his obvious talent. Now, Mike Evans and Chris Godwin have a long history of injuries, meaning there will likely be opportunities for Emeka Egbuka to shine in his rookie season. Teams generally don't spend a top 20 pick on a receiver if they don't intend to use them. The downside, though, is that if Evans and Godwin do somehow stay healthy, the ceiling for Egbuka is tremendously low. He's essentially battling Jalen McMillan for the wide receiver 3 role. And while the Bucs were one of the highest volume passing offenses, they do actually target the wide receiver 3 at a below average rate. If you're expecting production out of Egbuka early in the season, you'll likely be disappointed unless something surprising happens with Godwin and Evans. Josh Downs has outplayed Michael Pittman et al. At times when healthy and could feasibly emerge as the Colts' target vacuuming wide receiver 1 in an improved offense. The problem is that most of his fantasy production occurred with Joe Flacco last year, and Anthony Richardson and Daniel Jones are far more inclined to just take off and run than they are to check down to someone like a Josh Downs. His ceiling is very low, and I think his upside is low as well. I don't feel great about Downs, but I do have to acknowledge that if you're desperate for some depth, he is someone who can offer that. Jack Beck was a surprise second rounder who has a real opportunity to become the team's wide receiver 1. Geno Smith's shown the capacity to create multiple fantasy relevant receivers, and Jacoby Myers is hardly an ominous opponent for targets. This offense is plain screaming out for an alpha wide receiver. You could argue it's Beck, although Donta Thornton has been getting a lot of talk in OTAs as being the true likely number 1 guy. The downside, though, is that Brock Bowers is the actual number 1 guy, and Ashton Genty will also be a top receiver in this offense. That lowers the ceiling of every single wide receiver for the Raiders. Heck, there's no guarantee that Beck will even get ahead of Trey Tucker, let alone Jacoby Myers and Donta Thornton and all the other guys who aren't even wide receivers. Feels weird ranking someone who doesn't even have a team at the moment, but Keenan Allen's been a fantasy stud for much of the last decade, and he's only 1 year removed from a PPR wide receiver 6 season, though, where he did somehow also miss 4 games. The veteran slot man could still look good at times in 2024 when injuries didn't get in the way. So if he finds the right spot, he could shine again. Of course, the downside is that he doesn't currently have a team, and if he goes somewhere like, I don't know, the Bills, he could be a real fantasy bargain, but if he ends up in a crowded depth chart or with a mediocre quarterback, all of a sudden he's someone you don't want in your fantasy team at all. Of course, you're getting very late in drafts, and for that reason, I do feel good about the upside of taking Allen. At 58, I've got Luther Burden, a slot receiver in a Ben Johnson offense. Well, that sounds like someone who could be successful, but he's not Amon-Ra St. Brown. The comparisons are legit, but not based on talent, more so based on role. Burden is exactly the same style of player, but his role in this offense could be rather high volume, and that's fantasy gold. The problem is that unlike the Lions, the Bears have DJ Moore and Rome Odunze and Colson Loveland and Cole Kmet and DeAndre Swift and a heap of other guys who could certainly threaten for the limited targets that Caleb Williams is going to give out. That gives Burden a very low ceiling, even if he can lock down the slot role early in the season. Marvin Mims was the surprise wide receiver 29 over the final 7 weeks of last season, even though the Broncos had their bye week in that stretch, and Mims failed to surpass 50% of snaps at any point during the season. He's a third-year breakout candidate if Jordan Payton gives Mims the opportunity. The downside, though, is that the Broncos have used a heavy receiver rotation behind Courtland Sutton, and the drafting of Pat Bryant, who admittedly was a major reach in the 3rd round, suggests that that's unlikely to change this year. Mims has a tremendously low floor, but hey, you're going to draft someone late in drafts, you might as well swing for the fences, and I think Mims gives you the upside you should be craving. And finally, at number 60, it's Rashad Bateman. Rashad Bateman was the primary recipient of the Ravens' improved pass game last season. He had 9 touchdowns, leading to a PPR wide receiver 40 season. If 2025 looks like 2024, Bateman will be a solid fantasy depth option in deeper leagues, especially in non-PPR. But the downside is that any regression at all in the passing game or a change of role among any of the players, whether it's Bateman specific or otherwise, will make Bateman totally unusable in fantasy. He's never had more than 46 receptions in a season. That was in his rookie year back in 2021, meaning you're going to need very efficient production on a weekly basis for Bateman to pay off at all. Now, just a couple of other guys I want to mention before we wrap up. Christian Kirk has a little bit of upside. His last healthy season, he was getting 1,100 yards as the PPR wide receiver 14. We know that the Texans do have targets to go around. If he can get that slot role that Stephon Diggs had last season, he does have some upside. Rashid Shaheed was big to start last season, but I'm not too excited about him. I find it very hard to believe that the Saints wide receiver 2 is going to have any value at all. Xavier Legette emerged as a clear starter partway through last season before injury ended his season. The drafting of Ted McMillan really hurts him, but he could arguably still be something given he's a former first-round receiver only a season ago. Hollywood Brown has been good at times in the past. Injuries derailed his last season, but if you can get a clear-cut role for the Chiefs, he could be good for this season. And finally, Joshua Palmer with the Bills. I kind of feel pretty good about his chances of doing something, given there's so few threats in the Bills there. I don't really buy the talent, and I feel like he's more of a deep threat, but in a best ball league, or if you're looking for a real depth option, I think Palmer at least offers you something. A couple of other names worth mentioning. Calvin Austin is nominally the number 2 guy for the Steelers at the moment. If you're looking for a real depth option late in drafts and you're struggling at wide receiver, I feel like you can do worse than someone like a Calvin Austin or even a Ray McLeod, who was top 5 in wide receiver 3 production last season. Some other upside guys that are interesting. A lot of people talking about Kyle Williams for the Patriots, and I understand why. He could nut out a role in an offense that needs to pass the ball a little bit more. And also Arian Smith, I think, could be the wide receiver 2 for the Jets this season. So for that reason, if you're looking for someone with a little bit of upside late in drafts, you can get Arian Smith in the last round most of the time. No one is talking about this guy, but I love him. I believe he deserved to go earlier than the 4th round of the draft, and I feel like he could be a real asset for the Jets this season. And that's all we've got for our wide receiver rankings for this early part of the season. If you've got any questions, make sure you hit me up. Plus, if you need help for your draft, well, I'm here to help. For the last couple of years, we have been offering personalized draft rankings. We've had a lot of success with a lot of people winning their leagues for the first time. Now, if you struggle in your drafts, you just don't know what positions to take, I can help you out by taking your specific draft settings and telling you how to value players, particularly with positions relative to each other. So just email me at benwasley23@gmail.com. And for a very low price, happy to help you out or at least talk about options for you. I look forward to chatting to you guys next time when we talk tight ends on the Fantasy First Down.